Before the first city was ever built, before the first law was ever written, before anyone thought to scratch a symbol into wet clay and call it a record of the world, human beings had already been here for a very long time. Not vaguely human, not almost human, fully, completely, biologically identical to you in every way that matters. The same brain, the same nervous system, the same capacity for language and music and grief and wonder and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being conscious in a world that doesn't explain itself. They had already been here by the most conservative scientific estimates for at least 90,000 years before the first city rose from the dust of ancient Mesopotamia. Some researchers believe the number is far larger than that, and in all that time they left behind almost nothing that has survived to tell us who they were. This is the silent age of humanity, not the age before humans existed, not the age before humans were fully formed, the age before civilization, before writing, before agriculture, before the kinds of permanence that leave traces, that can survive 10,000 years of erosion and burial and chemical dissolution. The age that historians skip over in a sentence or two, the age that textbooks dismiss as the Paleolithic or the Stone Age, and then quickly move past, eager to get to the part of the story where things get interesting, where empires rise and kings are named and battles are recorded, and the great drama of recorded human history begins. But here is what keeps me lying awake when I think about it too carefully. The silent age was not the uninteresting age. It was not the primitive age. It was not the empty age. It was 90,000 years of fully modern human beings building lives and communities and knowledge and meaning in ways so rich and so complex that we have barely begun to understand them, and whose story is almost entirely lost. Almost entirely, not completely. And that difference, the difference between entirely and almost entirely, is the thing that makes this one of the most haunting and most profound mysteries in all of human history. Because scattered across the world, in caves and buried sites, and in the sediments of ancient lake beds, fragments of that silent age have survived. A piece of ochre, scratched with precise geometric lines. A shell perforated and polished for wearing as an ornament. A burial, careful and deliberate, with the body arranged and the grave prepared, and objects placed with the dead for whatever journey or transformation the survivors believed was coming. These fragments are tiny. They are almost nothing compared to the mass of human experience they represent. But each one is a message that crossed tens of thousands of years to reach us, a message pressed into the only material durable enough to survive the weight of time. And what each one says is the same thing, said in the same voice across all the distances of years. We were here. We were real. We were more than you think. Tonight, we are going to sit with the silent age. We are going to try to understand what it was and what it means. We are going to look at the fragments that survived and ask what they tell us, and then we are going to sit honestly with what they cannot tell us, the enormity of the silence that surrounds them, and try to feel the shape of all those missing years. This will not resolve into a clean conclusion or a satisfying answer. The silent age does not offer those. What it offers instead is something different and, I think, more valuable. A sense of the true depth of the human story. The understanding that what we call civilization is not the whole story, but only the most recent chapter, and that the chapters before it were written by people as real and as complicated and as fully alive as anyone who has lived since. The word before carries a dangerous simplicity. Before civilization, before history. Before the world became what we know it to be. It sounds like a threshold, a clean line drawn between the time when things were simple and the time when they became complex, between the age of wandering and the age of building, between the age when humans were essentially animals with better tools and the age when they became something recognizably modern. We love this idea of the threshold because it makes the story manageable. It gives us a beginning. It gives us a before and an after. It makes the vast, incomprehensible sweep of deep time feel ordered and legible. But the threshold is an illusion. There was no moment when humanity crossed from one state to another. There was no morning when the world woke up primitive and went to bed civilized. There was only the long, slow, uneven, repeatedly interrupted and repeatedly rebuilt process of human beings making sense of the world they found themselves in, generation after generation for longer than our imaginations are really built to hold. When paleoanthropologists talk about anatomically modern humans, they mean people who are biologically identical to any person alive today. Same skull shape, same brain volume, same vocal apparatus capable of producing the full range of human speech, same hands, same eyes, same everything. The fossil record for anatomically modern humans extends back at least 300,000 years in some interpretations, and the consensus minimum is somewhere around 200,000 years. For the purposes of the story we are telling tonight, the relevant number is roughly 100,000 years, because that is the outer edge of the period in which we have the clearest evidence of what researchers call behavioral modernity. The suite of complex behaviors, symbolic thinking, advanced tool manufacture, long-distance trade, ritual activity that marks the life of a fully realized human culture, as opposed to merely a biologically modern body. 100,000 years. 100,000 years before the first clay tablet was pressed in Mesopotamia, before the first stone block was laid in Egypt, before the first grain was cultivated in the Fertile Crescent. Fully modern human beings were alive and active and building something, even if almost everything they built has since dissolved into the ground. The before we are talking about is not a lesser time. It is not an earlier and simpler version of the story we already know. It is its own story, a story of almost incomprehensible duration, lived by people of complete and total cognitive parity with every person who has lived since, in conditions of extraordinary difficulty and extraordinary beauty, leaving almost no trace that time has not erased. The silence of the before is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of impermanence, the silence of a world built from wood and bone and memory and song, none of which survive the chemistry of the earth for very long. To sit with the before is to sit with the largest loss in human history, the near total dissolution of 90,000 years of human experience, and to try to imagine, across that loss, the fullness of what was there. There is a fact about human evolution that most popular accounts of prehistory handle awkwardly, often by simply not mentioning it or by mentioning it in passing, and then immediately contradicting it with the way they continue to describe ancient people. The fact is this: the human brain reached its current size, organization, and capacity somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, not gradually approaching its current form over the subsequent millennia, not slowly becoming more capable as civilization advanced and more complex problems were encountered. It arrived in something very close to its current form, and then it stayed there, available for use, ready and capable for the entire subsequent history of the species, including all 90,000 years of the Silent Age. This means that when you imagine a person living 90,000 years ago, you should not imagine someone with a simpler or more limited mind than yours. You should not imagine a being on the threshold of real thought, only partially able to plan ahead, only dimly aware of itself, only beginning to develop the emotional complexity and social sophistication that you experience as ordinary features of being a person. The person living 90,000 years ago had exactly the cognitive architecture that you have, the same working memory, the same capacity for language at any level of complexity, the same ability to think about the past and the future, to imagine hypothetical scenarios, to reason about abstract relationships, to hold multiple conflicting ideas simultaneously and think through their implications. The same emotional depth, the same capacity for love and grief and hope and fear, and the specific human hunger for meaning that drives people to ask why when they would be better served by simply accepting what is. This changes everything about how you should approach the silent age. If the people who lived in those years had minds like yours, then the silence of the archaeological record is not a reflection of the emptiness or simplicity of their inner lives. It is simply the silence of impermanence. It is the silence that would swallow all traces of your own life too. If it were lived in organic materials in an open landscape for 10,000 years, then 20,000, then 50,000. Your books would dissolve, your buildings would crumble, and their foundations would be buried under meters of accumulated sediment. The music you loved would vanish at the speed of sound. The stories you told would die with the last person who remembered them. What would remain, in the best case, in the places with the best preservation conditions, would be your most durable small objects, your tools, some of your bones, perhaps the marks you made on stone surfaces. And from those fragments, someone looking back at your life from 50,000 years in the future would probably conclude that your life was simpler and less rich than it actually was, because the things that made it rich, the relationships, the language, the art, the ceremony, the interior life, were all made of materials that time could dissolve. The brain that was already there, fully formed and fully capable, 90,000 years before civilization began, is the central fact of the Silent Age. Everything else follows from it. The knowledge systems those people built, the symbolic cultures they created, the ceremonies they performed, and the beliefs they held, and the stories they told, and the relationships they maintained, and the grief they felt when those relationships ended. All of it was generated by a brain of complete modern complexity, operating in a world of extraordinary challenge and demanding the same quality of intelligence and creativity and social cooperation that any subsequent human civilization has demanded. The silence of the record is not the silence of limitation. It is the silence of materials that didn't last. In a cave on the southern coast of South Africa called Blombos Cave, archaeologists working in the 1990s and 2000s found something that quietly but decisively changed the conversation about when human beings became fully human in the behavioral sense, not just the biological one. They found pieces of ochre, the iron-rich mineral pigment that has been associated with human symbolic behavior across the world and across deep time. And these pieces of ochre were engraved, not randomly scratched, not accidentally marked. Deliberately, carefully, repeatedly engraved with geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines and parallel lines and forms that are clearly the product of intentional design, rather than accidental abrasion. And the dates on these pieces of ochre ran to approximately 77,000 years, with some evidence of symbolic ochre use at the site going back to 100,000 years. 77,000 years ago, someone in what is now South Africa sat down with a piece of iron-rich stone and scratched a precise geometric pattern into its surface. We do not know who, We do not know their name or their language or their community or any specific thing about their life, but we know, from the care and the precision and the deliberateness of those lines, that they were a person doing a person thing, a thing that has no explanation in terms of immediate physical survival, a thing that only makes sense if you understand the person doing it as someone with an interior life rich enough to make the representation of abstract geometric form meaningful to them, either personally or socially or both. Ochre use, in general, is not about physical survival. It does not make hunting more effective or shelter warmer or water cleaner. Ochre is a pigment, and pigments are used to color things, and coloring things is always, at its heart, a symbolic act, a way of saying that appearance matters, that things can mean more than their physical properties, that the visible world is also a world of significance and communication. And Blombos Cave is not alone. It is not an anomaly, not the lone site of an isolated, precocious community that somehow developed symbolic thought tens of thousands of years before everyone else. Across Africa and the Middle East and Southeast Asia, evidence of early symbolic behavior keeps accumulating at sites that date back 100,000 years and more. Shell beads perforated for wearing as ornaments, found in Morocco at more than 100,000 years of age. Systematic ochre use at Pinnacle Point on the South African coast dating to 160,000 years ago, associated with the first evidence of humans exploiting marine resources at scale, including shellfish gathered with an understanding of seasonal availability that implies sophisticated ecological knowledge. Geometric engravings at multiple sites across Africa, ranging in age from 30,000 to more than 70,000 years. Each of these finds is a data point in an increasingly clear picture. The symbolic and artistic impulse, the impulse to impose meaning and pattern on the material world, to make marks that communicate across the barrier between one mind and another, was not a late invention of the Upper Paleolithic. It was an early and fundamental feature of modern human behavior, already present when the Silent Age began. What the ochre and the beads and the engravings are telling us, each one in its small but persistent voice, is that the people of the Silent Age were not waiting for civilization to give them an interior life. They already had one. It expressed itself in forms that have mostly not survived, in the colors they wore and the patterns they painted on perishable surfaces, and the symbolic objects they carried and used in rituals we can no longer reconstruct. But the forms that did survive, the hardest and most durable residue of a symbolic life, lived almost entirely in organic materials, are enough to tell us that the interior life was there, that it was rich, and that the silence of the archaeological record is a silence produced by the fragility of the materials, not by the poverty of the experience. One of the most extraordinary things that happened in the Silent Age, one of the most extraordinary things any species has ever done in the entire history of life on Earth, produced almost no archaeological record that we can find. It was the movement of modern human beings out of Africa and across the world, the colonization of every habitable continent on the planet within roughly 80,000 years of beginning, by people with stone tools and organic materials, and nothing that we would recognize as technology for large-scale geographic expansion. And it happened so gradually, so incrementally, in such small steps over such large spans of time, that the physical traces of it are scattered, incomplete, debated, and in many cases simply inaccessible because they now lie under 100 meters of ocean water. The coastlines of the world during the height of the last glacial period, roughly 20,000 years ago, but with sea levels substantially lower for much of the preceding period as well, were dramatically different from the coastlines we know today. The sea was lower in some regions by 120 meters, and the land exposed by that lower sea level included enormous areas that are now underwater. Areas that would have been among the most productive and most attractive environments for human habitation, rich in marine and coastal resources, temperate in climate, easily navigable by people following the shoreline. If the movement of modern humans out of Africa followed a coastal route, as many researchers believe the early dispersal did, then most of the sites where those early travelers lived and camped and left their marks are now on the floor of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, inaccessible without the kind of underwater archaeological survey that is only beginning to be technologically feasible. This is one of the most important and least appreciated facts about the Silent Age. The silence is not uniformly distributed. The silence is much deeper for some environments and some periods than for others, and it is deepest precisely for the environments that were likely the most heavily inhabited during the Silent Age, the coastlines and the lowland river valleys and the productive margins of the landscape that are now buried, submerged, or eroded beyond recovery. What we know about the movement of modern humans across the world comes from the scraps of sites that happen to be in geologically favorable locations, on elevated ground, in caves with good preservation conditions, in environments dry enough to protect organic materials. Everything that happened in the rich, productive, heavily inhabited coastal zones of the Pleistocene world is for the most part simply gone. What we can say from genetics and from the sites that do survive is that the movement was real and that it was remarkable. By 60,000 years ago, or possibly earlier, people were in Australia. Think about what that means. Even at the lowest sea levels of the glacial period, the crossing from the southernmost tip of what is now Southeast Asia to the northern coast of what is now Australia required navigating at least 60 or 70 kilometers of open ocean. Not drifting, not being carried by currents, deliberately crossing open water with no visible destination in vessels built from organic materials that have left no trace, using navigational knowledge that was held entirely in human memory and transmitted entirely through speech. The people who made that crossing were extraordinary. They were brave, and they were skilled, and they were intelligent, and they were motivated by whatever combination of necessity and curiosity and boldness drives human beings to go somewhere no one has ever gone before. They did not have the internet or GPS or the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years of maritime civilization. They had their minds, their communities, their knowledge, and the sea. For most of the Silent Age, modern humans were not alone in the world. This is one of the stranger and more wonderful and more uncomfortable facts about the period before civilization, the period that our standard historical narratives almost entirely ignore. For most of the time that fully modern Homo sapiens has existed, there were other kinds of humans sharing the landscape, living in adjacent territories or overlapping ranges, sometimes encountering each other in ways that left marks in the genetic record that we are only now beginning to fully understand. The Neanderthals are the best known of these others, and the most consistently misrepresented. The image of the Neanderthal that persists in popular imagination, the stooped, brutish, dull-eyed creature barely distinguishable from an ape, is not supported by the evidence. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, at least as large as ours. They made tools of genuine sophistication, not primitive smashing of rocks together, but deliberate knapping with an understanding of fracture mechanics that required planning and skill to apply. They controlled fire and used it to cook and to provide warmth and to process materials. They cared for their injured and their old, as evidenced by individuals in the fossil record who survived debilitating injuries and chronic conditions that would have required social support to live with for years. And they buried their dead, sometimes with apparent deliberateness of placement, and sometimes with what look very much like grave goods, though the interpretation of specific burials remains contested. Then there are the Denisovans, an archaic human population known almost entirely from a handful of bone fragments and teeth found in a single cave in Siberia, from whom we have nevertheless managed to extract enough ancient DNA to know that they were a real and distinct population that ranged widely across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, that they interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans, and that their genetic legacy survives today at significant levels in some modern populations, particularly in Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australia, where Denisovan ancestry can reach 4 to 6% of the genome. We know their genes. We know almost nothing else about them. Their language is gone. Their culture is gone. Their specific history, which by genetic evidence was long and rich and geographically expansive, is almost entirely silent. And then there is the extraordinary fact of interbreeding. Modern genetic analysis has made it unambiguous. The ancestors of people alive today had children with Neanderthals and with Denisovans, and possibly with other archaic human populations that have not yet been clearly identified in the fossil or genetic record. If you are of non-African ancestry, you carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in your genome. That DNA is not inert. It influences your immune system. It may influence your metabolism and your response to certain pathogens. It is a living inheritance from encounters that happened in the Silent Age, between beings who were different enough to be called different species, but similar enough to produce viable children. Those children grew up. They had their own children, and the record of those encounters, compressed into base pairs of DNA, is sitting in your cells tonight as you prepare for sleep, long after every other trace of the people who produced it has dissolved. The Silent Age was not peaceful. It was not a long, uninterrupted development toward increasing cultural complexity, punctuated occasionally by interesting innovations. It was a period of enormous and repeated catastrophe, geological and climatic and epidemiological, and the effects of those catastrophes on human populations were severe in ways that the archaeological record, sparse as it already is, makes it almost impossible to fully appreciate. The silence of the record for certain periods and certain regions is not always just the silence of impermanence. Sometimes it is the silence of genuine, devastating population collapse, the silence that follows the death of enough people to disrupt the cultural transmission that keeps knowledge alive, the silence that follows the erasure of entire communities with their particular ways of knowing the world. The Toba supervolcano eruption, which occurred approximately 74,000 years ago in what is now northern Sumatra, is the most dramatic of these catastrophes and the most debated in its effects on human populations. The eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years, releasing somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere and creating the conditions for what geologists call a volcanic winter, a period of dramatically reduced global temperatures and reduced solar radiation caused by the atmospheric loading of sulfuric aerosols and volcanic ash. How long the worst effects lasted is debated, with estimates ranging from a few years to a decade or more for the initial cooling and potential degradation of plant communities across large parts of the world. How severely this affected human populations is even more debated. Some geneticists have interpreted the relatively low genetic diversity of modern humans as evidence of a severe population bottleneck that occurred around this time, possibly reducing the global human population to as few as 10,000 individuals. Others have contested the bottleneck interpretation and pointed to archaeological sites in India that appear to show continuous occupation through the Toba ash layer, suggesting that at least some populations survived with their cultural traditions essentially intact. Whatever the specific numbers, the general principle holds. The Silent Age was repeatedly and sometimes catastrophically interrupted by events that crashed populations, disrupted cultural transmission, and erased bodies of knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. Each time a community was destroyed or dispersed by a volcanic winter, or an extended drought or a wave of disease, knowledge died with it. The specific plants and their specific medicinal properties. The specific navigational techniques adapted to a specific coastline. The specific ritual practices that maintained social cohesion and gave meaning to the transitions of life and death. The specific stories that encoded ecological knowledge in memorable narrative form. All of it transmitted through speech, held only in living memory, with no backup, no written record, no way to recover what was lost when the people who held it were gone. And yet, humanity survived. Through Toba and through every subsequent catastrophe, through the glacial maximum and the megafaunal extinctions and the rapid sea level rise at the end of the Pleistocene and every other disruption that the geological record documents, humanity survived. Not by accident, not by luck alone, though luck certainly played a role. By the specific qualities that define us as a species, the flexibility and the adaptability and the specific human genius for learning from new conditions and adjusting behavior accordingly, for building social bonds strong enough to distribute knowledge and labor and resources across a community in ways that make the whole more resilient than any individual part. For preserving through story and ceremony and careful transmission the accumulated wisdom that makes the difference between a community that can survive a crisis and one that cannot. The Silent Age was built from catastrophe and rebuilding, collapse and recovery, loss and reinvention. And through all of it, the human mind, unchanged in its capacity, kept generating culture and knowledge and meaning from whatever materials were available. The aspect of the Silent Age that is hardest to recover, and perhaps most important to understand, is the social world, not the tools, not the migrations, not even the symbolic objects, though those are the closest we can get to direct evidence of the inner life. The social world, the specific structures and norms and relationships and obligations that organized human communities in the tens of thousands of years before writing gave us a window into them, the specific ways that people understood themselves in relation to each other and to the world around them, the specific moral and emotional and spiritual frameworks within which they navigated the universal challenges of being human. This social world is almost entirely inaccessible to us, and it was, almost certainly, the most important thing about the Silent Age. What we can reconstruct from the comparative study of hunter-gatherer societies that survived into the era of anthropological documentation, from the genetic evidence of ancient population structures, and from the rare but telling fragments of the archaeological record, suggests that the social world of the Silent Age was neither as simple as the popular imagination assumes, nor as similar to subsequent civilizations as we might wish. Hunter-gatherer societies are not uniformly egalitarian utopias, as an older romanticizing tradition sometimes portrayed them, but they do tend toward forms of social organization that differ in important ways from the hierarchical, property-based, institutionally complex societies that agriculture and urbanization produced. The accumulation of material wealth is difficult when you are mobile. Status hierarchies do not disappear in mobile societies, but they tend to be less rigid and less heritable than in settled ones. Leadership tends to be situational rather than permanent, earned through demonstrated competence in specific domains rather than inherited or institutionalized. Decision-making tends toward consensus rather than command, and the social safety net, the community's obligation to provide for its members who cannot fully provide for themselves, tends to be strong in ways that the internal logic of mobile subsistence requires. None of this means that the social world of the Silent Age was without conflict, without hierarchy, without the full range of human social dysfunction that has been present in every documented human society. Violence was real. Inequality was real, even if it took different forms than the inequality of agricultural civilizations. Exclusion and belonging and the social pain of rejection were real. The social world of the Silent Age was a human social world, which means it contained everything that human social worlds contain. Love and loyalty and generosity and betrayal and jealousy and grief, and the specific humor that humans develop in response to the absurdity of their situation and the ache of knowing that everything ends. It was complicated and rich, and often difficult, because that is what human social life is, in every era and every form it has ever taken. What we cannot see, what the silence of the record most completely swallows, is the texture of it, the specific arguments that shaped specific communities, the specific love stories that produced specific children, the specific crises of leadership and loyalty that determined whether particular groups survived or fragmented, the specific individuals who were brilliant or foolish or courageous or cruel in ways that mattered to the people around them, in ways that shaped the specific trajectories of specific communities, in the way that individuals always shape communities, through the particular weight of their particular personality pressing on the world. All of these specific people, with their specific faces and specific voices and specific ways of laughing and specific ways of being afraid, are part of the silence. They were as real as any specific person has ever been. They had an impact on the world around them that rippled outward through the generations. And their names are gone. Their faces are gone. Their voices are gone. So completely gone that we cannot even mourn them with any specificity, only with the general grief of loss that the Silent Age as a whole seems to ask of us. Here is what I think about when I try to grasp the scale of the loss represented by the Silent Age. I think about pharmacology. I think about the specific, accumulated, empirically tested knowledge of the medicinal properties of specific plants in specific environments, knowledge that was developed over generations of careful observation and systematic experimentation conducted under the highest stakes conditions possible, because getting it wrong meant people died, and getting it right meant people lived, and that was therefore refined with a rigor and attention to outcome that formal science rarely matches. This knowledge is almost entirely gone. What has survived in the oral traditions of indigenous communities that maintained continuous cultural connection to their ancestral territories into the modern era has repeatedly turned out, when investigated by pharmacologists, to contain compounds of genuine therapeutic significance. The willow bark that indigenous peoples of multiple continents used to treat pain and fever contains salicylic acid. Disclaimer: this video contains fictional and / or AI-assisted elements created for artistic and entertainment purposes. It does not aim to mislead viewers or present real-world events as factual documentation. The active component of aspirin. The cinchona bark that Andean peoples used to treat fever turns out to contain quinine, the first effective treatment for malaria. The list is long, but it represents only the fraction that survived to be documented, only the communities that maintained their traditions through the disruptions of colonization and cultural change. Only the knowledge that happened to persist in forms accessible to outside investigators. The knowledge developed in the Silent Age, refined over 90,000 years in every inhabited environment on Earth, was of comparable or greater depth and scope. It included not just pharmacology but navigation, ecology, geology, meteorology, hydrology, animal behavior, plant biology, soil science, and every other domain of empirical knowledge required to survive and live well in specific natural environments. It was knowledge of astonishing precision and specificity, tuned to the particular conditions of particular places by the unforgiving selection pressure of outcomes that mattered. And virtually all of it is gone. Not because it was wrong, not because it was superseded by more accurate understanding, but because it was held in the memories of human beings and transmitted through their voices. And when those human beings died without successors, or their communities were disrupted beyond recovery, the knowledge died with them, as silently and as completely as their names. This is, if you really sit with it, one of the greatest intellectual losses in human history. Not the loss of art, though that is also real and also devastating. Not the loss of ceremony or story or social complexity, though those too are real and devastating. The loss of 90,000 years of empirical knowledge about the natural world, developed by minds of complete modern capability, tested against reality with brutal consistency, refined over more generations than we can easily count. The specific medicinal traditions of communities in environments that are now deserts or underwater or deforested beyond recognition. The specific navigational knowledge of coastal peoples whose shores are now 100 meters below the surface of the sea. The specific ecological management practices of communities who understood their landscapes with an intimacy that professional ecologists rarely match. All of it gone, not in a moment, not in a single catastrophe, but slowly and continuously over thousands of years, as the communities that held it were disrupted and dispersed and absorbed and replaced, each transition taking with it another layer of the knowledge that took generations to build. Every human society that has ever been studied, without a single documented exception, has ceremony, ritual. Structured, collectively performed, symbolically laden behavior at the significant transitions of life and the recurring turns of the year. Behavior that is not reducible to its practical effects, that involves effort and sometimes sacrifice, and almost always some form of aesthetic elaboration, and that is understood by its participants to be significant in a way that goes beyond the immediately material. The death of a member of the community, the passage of a young person into adulthood, the beginning of a planting season or a hunting season, the return of a successful expedition, the resolution of a crisis, the specific crisis of collective grief or collective fear that requires some collective acknowledgement and processing before the community can move forward. Every human community, everywhere, in every era we have evidence of, marks these transitions with ceremony. This means, with a certainty that requires no physical evidence to support it, that the communities of the Silent Age had ceremony. They had their equivalent of funerals and initiations and celebrations and commemorations. They had collective ritual that served the same function that collective ritual has served in every subsequent human culture. To synchronize the emotional states of community members, to reinforce shared identity and shared belief, to mark the significance of significant moments in ways that the ordinary flow of daily life cannot, to provide a framework for the processing of experiences too large and too disorienting to be managed by individual psychology alone. The ceremony was there. Its specific forms, its specific content, the specific movements and sounds and objects and words that gave it its particular character in specific communities, at specific times in the Silent Age, these are all gone. But the ceremony itself, in whatever form it took, was as real and as important as any ceremony that has been documented in any subsequent human culture. The burials we have found give us the most direct evidence of this. At Skull Cave and Kafse in Israel, burials of modern humans have been found that date to approximately 90 to 100,000 years ago, making them among the oldest deliberate human burials known. The deliberateness is important. A body placed in a specific position, a boar's jaw held in the arms of one of the dead, red ochre marking the bones. These are not the actions of people disposing of a biological problem. These are the actions of people who understood the person they were burying as a person, who understood that person's death as an event of significance that required acknowledgement and care, who had beliefs about what death was and what the dead were owed, and what the relationship between the living and the dead meant. We cannot know what those specific beliefs were. We cannot hear the words that were spoken or know the specific form the ceremony took. But we know it was there, in the Silent Age, 90,000 years before the first written text tried to describe what humans do when one of them dies. There is a practice so old and so universal in our species that it predates the species itself. It predates Homo sapiens by hundreds of thousands of years, predates every other specifically human behavior, predates even the brain that makes us distinctively human. It is the control and use of fire, and the gathering of human beings around fire at the end of the day, the specific social institution that may have been more formative for the human mind and the human community than any other single thing in the evolutionary history of our lineage. The fire that every evening drew the community together, that marked the transition from the day of movement and work to the night of rest and conversation, that provided warmth and light and a center around which the social world organized itself. That was the original theater and the original classroom and the original sacred space, all at once. Around those fires in the Silent Age, things happened that we cannot see but can infer with confidence. People talked. This is not a trivial observation. For social mammals with the specific cognitive architecture of modern humans, extended face-to-face conversation is not merely a pleasant way to pass time. It is the primary mechanism of knowledge transfer, the medium through which the accumulated ecological and social and practical wisdom of the community is transmitted to the next generation, the forum in which the norms and values of the group are negotiated and expressed and reinforced, the space in which the stories that make a community coherent are told and retold and refined. The conversation around the fire was, for the communities of the Silent Age, what the library and the school and the law court and the religious service all are for subsequent civilizations, the central institution of cultural transmission. What did they talk about? We cannot know. Not a word has survived from any conversation held in the Silent Age. Not a single sentence. The languages themselves have not survived, and the languages were just the medium. The content, the specific topics and stories and arguments and explanations and jokes and declarations, the content is absolutely and permanently gone. But we know because this is what human beings do when they have language and community and fire and time, that they told stories. They told stories about the world around them, about the animals and the seasons and the landscape and the water sources and the patterns of the sky. They told stories about each other, about the specific individuals in their community and their specific qualities and specific histories. They told stories about the past, the memory of what had happened before in ways that informed what to do now. and they told stories about what lies beyond ordinary experience and ordinary knowledge, about the meaning of birth and death and the turning of the year and the presence in the world of things that cannot be directly seen, but that seem to be there, pressing through the fabric of experience in ways that demand acknowledgement and interpretation. Those stories are gone. Every story told around every fire in 90,000 years of human evenings is gone, as completely and as permanently as if they had never been told. Except that they were told, and they mattered, and the people who heard them were changed by them, and the communities that were shaped by them survived and built and loved and were afraid and buried their dead with care, and pressed their hands against cave walls so that something of them would remain. The stories are gone, but the people who told them were real. And the world they built with those stories was real, and the silence left by all those gone stories is one of the most profound and most moving silences there is. Before we go any further into the silent age, I want to stop at the handprint. Not any specific handprint, though specific ones exist in specific caves, and they are extraordinary. The handprint as an act. The specific human act of pressing the hand against a surface and making a mark that is the exact shape of that hand, the hand of that specific person, unique among all hands that have ever existed or will exist, and leaving it there for whoever comes later to see. This act has been performed in caves on every inhabited continent. It appears in the archaeological record from as far back as 40,000 years, with certainty, and possibly further. It appears wherever modern humans went and wherever the conditions for preservation allowed something to survive. And it says the same thing, in the same wordless language, across all the distances of time and geography. I was here. This is my hand. I existed. Look, the people who made those handprints in the Silent Age were not making art in the sense that we usually mean by that word. They were not making decorative objects for aesthetic contemplation. They were making a specific kind of declaration in the most personal possible medium, the mark of the body itself, permanent on a surface that would outlast them. They were asserting their own reality. They were reaching across whatever distance they intuited between themselves and whatever future might exist, with no way to know if anyone would ever find what they left, and leaving the most irreducible evidence of their existence they could manage with the materials available. A hand pressed against stone and coloured pigment blown around it. The shape of a life. The proof that a person was here. Tens of thousands of these handprints have been found in caves around the world. Each one is a specific hand. Each one belongs to a person whose name is gone and whose face is gone and whose voice is gone. A person who was as real as you are, who felt the cold of the rock against their palm and saw the pigment settle around their fingers and knew, in whatever form knowing takes when language has no name for it yet, that they were doing something that mattered. We do not know why they did it. We have theories: ritual significance, territorial marking, initiation, the specific magic of leaving a trace of yourself in a place set apart from ordinary life. But the why is less important than the what. What they did was look at the world and feel the human need to mark it with evidence of their presence, the need that is the root of all art and all writing and all history, the need to say, I was real. Do not forget that I was real. In the cave at Chauvet in southern France, dated to more than 30,000 years ago, there is a section of wall covered in handprints, dozens of them, left by people who came to this specific place, in this specific rock, and pressed their hands against the stone in an act that must have meant something to them, that must have been part of a context of belief and practice and community understanding that is now completely gone. And among those handprints, there is one that researchers have identified as belonging to the same individual as a handprint found elsewhere in the cave. The same specific hand, the same person, returning to leave their mark in two places. We do not know their name. We do not know anything about them. But we know they were there, twice, in a place that mattered enough to return to, and in the specific shape of their hand, pressed against stone that has waited 30,000 years for someone to notice. They are here still. At some point in thinking about the silent age, the loss becomes difficult to hold. Not the loss of specific knowledge, though that is real, and its consequences are real. Not the loss of specific art or specific ceremony or specific language, though all of those are losses that deserve to be mourned. The loss itself, the sheer scale of lived human experience that has dissolved without leaving a trace sufficient for us to understand what it was. 90,000 years. In those 90,000 years, by conservative demographic estimates, somewhere between 10 billion and 20 billion human beings were born and lived and loved and were afraid and made things and told stories and died and were grieved. 10 to 20 billion complete human lives, each one as real and as full as any life lived in the 10,000 years since, and for virtually every one of them, nothing survives. Not a name, not a face, not a word spoken, not a single emotion recorded. The largest population of human beings who have ever lived, and the total surviving record of their experience, fits in a few dozen archaeological sites and a handful of genetic studies. There is a way to look at this that makes it feel primarily like an intellectual problem, a gap in the data that researchers are gradually filling in through increasingly sophisticated methods. And that is a real and legitimate way to look at it. But there is another way to look at it that I think deserves equal attention, and that is to feel the loss as a loss, to let the specific human weight of it settle, to acknowledge that the people of the Silent Age were not data points or archaeological problems, but actual human beings whose actual experiences of the actual world were as vivid and as significant to them as your experience is to you tonight, and whose complete disappearance from the record represents something that genuinely deserves to be grieved. They loved people who are completely gone, not just died in the ordinary way that everyone dies and is eventually forgotten. Gone in the way that no one will ever know they existed. Gone so completely that the love itself has left no record. Not a name mentioned in a text, not a grave with a name on it, not a story that was passed down even in garbled form. The woman who carried her child across the Australian land bridge and nursed it and taught it to recognize edible plants and watched it survive and felt the specific, fierce joy that is the reward of successful parenthood. She is gone, and the child is gone, and the love is gone, and there is no way to honor it except to acknowledge that it was real. The man who survived the Toba winter and rebuilt some fragment of his community's knowledge from whatever remained, who made the decisions that allowed some people to live when others were dying, who must have carried the specific weight of that survival and that loss for the rest of his life. He has gone so completely that even his bones have dissolved and we will never know he existed. The specific grief of specific people who lost specific people they loved, in the specific ways that the Silent Age provided for grief to be inflicted, that grief was real, and it was felt, and it mattered to the person feeling it exactly as much as grief has ever mattered to anyone, and it is gone as if it never was. But here is the other thing, the thing that transforms the story of the Silent Age from pure loss to something more complicated and more interesting and, in the end, more beautiful. The Silent Age is not only gone, it is also still here. Not in the form of records or traces or artifacts, but in the form of you. in the specific architecture of your nervous system, shaped over 100,000 years of human experience to respond to the world in ways that made sense in the world of the silent age. In the specific weights your emotions place on specific things, calibrated over that same span of time in conditions that are not the conditions you currently inhabit, but that nevertheless produced you. In the specific hungers and specific fears and specific pleasures and specific griefs that you experience as simply what it is to be alive, as the universal human condition, which they are, but which are universal because they were shaped long ago in circumstances very different from the ones you currently live in. Your fear of the dark, the specific quality of heightened alertness that certain kinds of darkness produce in you, regardless of whether you know intellectually that you are safe, was calibrated in the silent age in conditions where the darkness was genuinely dangerous, where the things that moved in the night beyond the firelight were sometimes things that could kill you, where the specific vigilance that darkness now produces in your nervous system was a survival advantage that was tested and refined over generation after generation of people who were sometimes right to be afraid and sometimes wrong, and in either case passed on to their children a nervous system that defaulted to caution when it could not see. Your need for story, the specific hunger for narrative that makes you lean in when someone says, "Let me tell you what happened," the pleasure you take in a well-constructed plot, and the way it holds your attention even when you know it is fiction. This is not a recent cultural development. It is the legacy of the campfire, of 90,000 years of evenings in which the transmission of important information through narrative was the primary mechanism by which communities maintained the knowledge that allowed them to survive. Your love of fire. The specific quality of comfort and safety and belonging that a fire produces, the way a campfire gathers people toward it and makes a group feel like a community and makes the world outside the circle of light feel temporarily irrelevant. This response was not invented by any civilization. It was built in the silent age, accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years of human evenings in which the fire was the center of the world, the place where the day ended and the night began, where the stories were told and the bonds were maintained and the knowledge was passed to the next generation. When you feel the specific peace of a fire, you are feeling what your ancestors felt, a feeling so ancient and so consistent that it is now part of the architecture of the human nervous system, a response that does not require culture to learn because it was built into the body long before any culture existed to teach it. The silent age asks a question. It asks it in the only language it has available, the language of absence, the language of the space where something was and is no longer. The language that requires the listener to imagine what the silence contains, rather than to read what it says. The question it asks over and over in the gaps between the fragments and the darkness around the handprints is this: what is the human story, really? Not the story we tell ourselves in the pages of history books, the story that begins with the first cities, and the first writing, and the first kings, and the first wars, and the first laws and treats, everything before that as merely biological backstory, as the warming-up period before the real drama began. What is the actual story of what it has meant to be human, in the full span of what it has meant, across all the time that fully modern human beings have been alive and building and loving and grieving and wondering? The answer that the silent age offers, in its fragmentary and inadequate but genuinely important way, is that the actual story is vastly older and vastly richer and vastly less centered on civilization than we usually admit. 90,000 years of fully modern human life preceded the first city. 90,000 years of communities and knowledge systems and symbolic cultures and ceremonies and love and grief and music and story and the specific human hunger for meaning that is the deepest and most consistent feature of our species. Civilization, the specific form of human social organization that produced writing and cities, and the kind of complexity that we call history, is remarkable, and its achievements are real, and its consequences for human life have been both extraordinary and terrible in ways that deserve careful attention. But it is not the whole story. It is not even close to being the whole story. It is 10,000 years of a 100,000-year story, and the 90,000 years it follows were not empty or simple or primitive. They were fully human. Understanding this changes something, or should change something, about how we think about ourselves and about what civilization is and what it is not. If 90,000 years of fully modern human life preceded civilization, and those 90,000 years were not impoverished or cognitively limited or culturally simple, then civilization is not a synonym for humanity. It is one specific form that human intelligence and human social organization have taken. One that has generated extraordinary things, and also generated things that are not extraordinary in ways we have not yet found adequate language for. It is not the destination the species was always moving toward. It is a path that was taken at a specific time in specific places, for specific reasons that had as much to do with climate and geography and contingency as with any intrinsic tendency in human nature. The people of the Silent Age were not failed civilizations. They were not proto-civilizations. They were something else entirely, something that does not have a good name in any language, shaped by the civilization that came after, and whose value and significance are therefore difficult to articulate in a vocabulary designed by and for the civilization that replaced them. I want to end in a specific place, at a specific moment, not because it is documented or reconstructed or in any way knowable from the evidence, but because it is the most universal of all human moments, the most constant across all the distances of time and culture and condition that separate us from the Silent Age. I want to end at the moment when the fire died down, and the last conversation faded, and the community of the Silent Age lay down in whatever shelter they had made, and closed their eyes and surrendered to sleep. Every human being who has ever lived has done this. The first Homo sapiens who walked out of Africa 60 or 70,000 years ago. The people who paddled their boats toward the coast of Australia. The survivors of the Toba winter who rebuilt their community from whatever remained. The people who pressed their hands against the cave walls of Chauvet and Altamira and Sulawesi. The people who buried their dead with ochre at Kafze and School. The people who made the shell beads in Morocco and the geometric engravings at Blombos Cave. Every person who ever lived in the Silent Age for 90,000 years of nights lay down at the end of the day and experienced the same thing you are perhaps about to experience now. The loosening of the day's grip, the settling of the body, the specific surrender of consciousness that has no adequate name except sleep. Sleep is older than civilization. It is older than Homo sapiens. It is one of the most ancient features of animal life, a biological necessity so fundamental that no amount of cultural or technological change has altered it, a daily return to vulnerability and rest that every human being who has ever lived has shared. When you lie down tonight, in whatever specific circumstances you find yourself in, you are doing what every person in the Silent Age did at the end of every day of their 90,000 years of living. The specific context is different. The specific sounds are different. The specific fears and the specific comforts and the specific thoughts that accompany the surrender to sleep are different. But the surrender itself, the loosening of the day, the closing of the eyes, the drift toward the country of sleep, this is universal and ancient, and it connects you, in the most physical and immediate way possible, to the people of the silent age. They are gone in every other sense. Their names are gone, and their faces are gone, and their languages are gone, and their knowledge is gone, and their stories are gone, and their ceremonies are gone, and their specific ways of being in the world are gone as completely as anything has ever been gone. But they laid down at night and closed their eyes, and so do you. And in that small but genuine way, the silent age is not entirely silent. It speaks in the oldest language there is, the language of the body's need, the language that requires no words and no culture and no tradition to understand, because it is already written in the architecture of every living thing. They slept. You sleep. Across all the distance that the silent age created between them and you, this much is continuous. This much was never broken. The ending of the day, the surrender to darkness, the return to rest that makes tomorrow possible. The silent age of humanity is not, in the end, a story about absence. It is a story about presence that has become absence, a story about lives that were fully lived and fully real and fully human in every way that matters, and that have since dissolved into the ground and the air and the chemical processes of a world that does not preserve things long enough for us to remember them. The 10 billion or 20 billion people who lived in those 90,000 years before the first civilization were not less real than the people who have lived since. They were not cognitively simpler or emotionally shallower or culturally less developed. They were fully human in every dimension that the word implies, and their lives contained everything that human life has ever contained. The love that makes loss devastating, the fear that makes courage possible, the hunger for meaning that makes religion and art and story and ceremony necessary, the specific stubborn refusal to simply accept the world as it is and not try to understand it, not try to make it mean something, not try to leave some mark on it that says I was here, I was real, I mattered. The handprints are still on the cave walls. The ochre engravings are still in the rock at Blombos. The shells are still in the museum cases, perforated and polished, and more than 100,000 years old. The burials are still in the ground at Skul and Kafse. These fragments, tiny and incomplete and surrounded by the enormous silence of everything that did not survive, are the last messages from the silent age, the last evidence that the age was not actually silent at all, that it was full of human noise and human life and human everything, and that only the specific fragility of the materials they used for living has made it seem, from our distant vantage point, like nothing was there. Something was there. Everything was there, the full weight and richness and complexity of human experience, lived by people as real as you are for longer than we usually allow ourselves to imagine, and the specific moment you are in right now, wherever you are, settling in for sleep, letting the day go, preparing for the nightly surrender that connects you to every human being who has ever lived, is part of that continuous story. Not the beginning of it, not anywhere near the beginning of it. The latest expression of something that began in Africa, in the dark, around a fire 90,000 years before anyone thought to write it down. If this conversation has given you something, if the people of the silent age feel a little more present to you after spending this time with them, if the handprint feels less like a historical curiosity and more like a message that was sent to you specifically across all that darkness, then please subscribe, because there is so much more to say. There are new findings every year that push the boundaries of what we think we know about the silent age, that find new evidence of complexity and creativity and symbolic life in the years before civilization. There are ancient genomes being sequenced, ancient sites being excavated with new methods, ancient oral traditions being documented before the last threads connecting us to those years are broken. The story is still being told, and every finding adds to our understanding of the people who lived it. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. I read every comment, and there is something that moves me genuinely about knowing that people in different places and different darknesses are lying down with these stories and finding in them something worth staying awake for, and then something worth sleeping with. The specific comfort of knowing that you are not alone in the dark, that every human being who has ever lived has been in this same darkness, has felt this same loosening of the day's grip, has made this same surrender to the night that makes tomorrow possible. The silent age is not silent because nothing was there. It is silent because everything it contained was made of things that time dissolves. But you are made of things that time has not yet dissolved. You are the continuation of a story that began 90,000 years before civilization, in a darkness much deeper and much fuller than the one you are lying in tonight. Carry it forward. Let it mean something. And sleep well, wherever you are, knowing that the silence is full of people just like you, who lay down at the end of their days and closed their eyes and trusted that the morning would come. It always has. There is a kind of architecture that leaves no stone, no foundation, no wall, no traced outline in the soil that a future archaeologist might one day find and measure and date. It is the architecture of a shared symbolic world, the structure of meaning and belief and cosmology that a community builds together in the space of shared language and shared experience, the invisible but entirely real framework within which every human life is lived, and without which a human life does not quite cohere into something livable. Every human community that has ever existed has built this architecture. The specific forms vary enormously. The specific beings that populate the cosmos, the specific relationships between human beings, and the non-human powers they perceive in the world around them. The specific narratives that explain why things are the way they are and what the right relationship between the present and the past and the future ought to be. All of these vary. But the architecture itself, the invisible shared structure of meaning, is universal. It is part of what makes a community rather than just a collection of individuals who happen to occupy the same territory. The communities of the Silent Age built this architecture. They could not have done otherwise. The cognitive systems that generate religious and spiritual experience, that produce the sense of meaning and the perception of significance, and the specific hunger for a framework that places human life within something larger than itself. These are not cultural add-ons to an otherwise secular human nature. They are features of the basic organization of the human brain, products of the same cognitive architecture that produces language and planning and social reasoning, and they were fully present in the people of the Silent Age. The burials tell us this. The ochre tells us this. The specific care with which certain sites were returned to across generations tells us this. These are the material traces of an invisible architecture that was as real to its builders as any physical structure that organized their understanding of themselves and the world in ways as comprehensive and as detailed as any subsequent cosmological system. What did they believe? We cannot know, not in any specific sense. The specific beings they perceived in the landscape, the specific stories they told about the origin of the world and the nature of death, and the relationship between human beings and the animals and plants and geological features of their environments, the specific obligations and prohibitions that their cosmological framework generated. All of this is gone with a completeness that is absolute. We cannot even reconstruct the shape of it with any confidence, because the specific forms that hunter-gatherer cosmologies take are so diverse, so responsive to the specific environments and specific histories of specific communities, that there is no single template to project backward into the silence. But the architecture was there. The invisible shared world, built in language and maintained in ceremony and transmitted in story, was there in every community of the Silent Age just as surely as it is in every community that has left a record of itself. And in that architecture, every member of those communities lived their lives, waking into a world that had specific meaning, navigating relationships that had specific obligations, facing birth and death and illness, and the turning of the seasons within a framework that made those things comprehensible and manageable rather than simply overwhelming. The architecture of the invisible world gave shape to the experience of being alive in the same way that it always has in every human community, before and after civilization began. Among all the human experiences of the Silent Age, the one that is most completely invisible in the archaeological record and most immediately humanizing to contemplate is childhood. The specific experience of growing up in the communities of the Silent Age, of being a child in the world before civilization, learning the specific skills and specific knowledge and specific norms and specific stories of a specific community in the specific way that children always learn, which is by watching and imitating and being shown and asking questions and making mistakes, and gradually, over years, accumulating the competence and the understanding that make it possible to function as an adult. The children of the Silent Age are almost entirely absent from the record. Their small bones dissolve faster than adult bones. The specific spaces and objects associated with their lives are rarely identifiable as such. And yet, they were there, millions of them across 90,000 years, each one fully in the process of becoming the kind of person their community needed and hoped for, each one carrying the future of their community's knowledge forward in the specific way that children do, by learning it. The occasional glimpse we get of those children when preservation conditions are good enough to show us something specific is extraordinary in its humanizing power. At Chauvet Cave, among the bear skulls and the lion paintings and the handprints of the adults, there are the footprints of a child who walked through the cave in the flickering light of a torch or a lamp, perhaps while an adult showed them the paintings or performed some ritual in the place, leaving the specific pattern of their small feet in the soft clay of the cave floor. The child's footprints have been preserved for 30,000 years by the specific conditions of that particular cave. They are the size you would expect for a child of perhaps 8 or 10 years. The child took small steps, and then slightly longer ones as they moved through the space. In the middle of all the extraordinary antiquity of Chauvet Cave, these footprints are perhaps the most immediately affecting thing there is, because they are so specific and so recognizable and so clearly the trace of a child who was, in that specific moment, simply a child in an extraordinary place with an adult who knew it well, doing something that children do in extraordinary places, which is to look around with wide eyes and try to understand what they are seeing. That child is gone. Every child of the Silent Age is gone, but the footprints are there pressed into clay that hardened around them 30,000 years ago, and they say the same thing that the handprints say, and the ochre engravings say, and the careful burials say. We were here. We were real. Our specific lives had a specific weight and a specific texture and a specific quality of experience that was as vivid to us as yours is to you. Do not forget us. And in the specific shape of a child's foot, pressed into ancient clay by the specific weight of a specific child, walking through a firelit cave 30 millennia ago. They are not forgotten. Not entirely, not yet. There is a theory in evolutionary biology called the grandmother hypothesis that proposes an explanation for one of the most distinctive features of human female biology, the menopause. No other primate experiences a significant post-reproductive lifespan. For most mammals, reproductive capacity and lifespan track closely together, ending at about the same time. But human women routinely live decades beyond the end of their reproductive years, in good health, with full cognitive function, with decades of accumulated experience and knowledge available for use. The grandmother hypothesis suggests that this pattern evolved because post-reproductive women in human communities made such substantial contributions to the survival of their grandchildren through direct care and through the provision of food and through the transmission of accumulated knowledge, that natural selection favored longer post-reproductive lives, producing a pattern that is unique in the primate order. If this hypothesis is correct and the evidence for it is substantial, then grandmothers were not peripheral figures in the silent age. They were central to it. They were, in communities where all knowledge was held in living memory and transmitted through living voices, the deepest archives of the knowledge that communities needed to survive. The people most likely to remember what happened the last time the drought came, or the migration route shifted, or the disease swept through. The people who had seen the most and had the most context and the most patience to teach what they knew to the people who would need it after they were gone. The grandmother who remembered how her grandmother's grandmother had navigated a specific crisis, and who could tell that story in a way that prepared her own grandchildren for the possibility of a similar crisis, was doing something of extraordinary practical value, not as a side effect of her care for family, but as a function that the specific organization of human social life had made central to community survival. These women are almost entirely invisible in the record. The archaeological record does not distinguish grandmothers from anyone else, except in the rare cases where age can be estimated from skeletal remains. The genetic record tells us that human female longevity is ancient and appears to be adaptive, which supports the hypothesis without making any specific grandmother visible. The oral traditions of hunter-gatherer communities, documented by ethnographers before they were disrupted, consistently emphasize the importance of elders, particularly female elders, as the keepers of the deepest knowledge, the authorities on the practices most likely to require judgment, developed across a long life of experience. But the specific grandmothers of the silent age, the specific women who held the deepest knowledge and who taught it to the people who needed it and who made the decisions that determined whether their communities survived specific crises, they are as completely gone as everyone else from those years. They were there. They mattered enormously, not just to the people who loved them, but to the survival and the cultural continuity of the communities they were part of. The knowledge they held was the difference, in some cases, between a community that could navigate a crisis and one that could not. And they are gone. Their knowledge dissolved, their voices silent, their specific contributions to the specific survival of specific communities that eventually produced, after tens of thousands of generations of subsequent transmission and transformation, people who are alive today, unremarked and unrecorded and unremembered. But they were there, and the world they helped to build and maintain and transmit, in whatever form it reached the next generation and the next, is part of what produced the world you are lying in right now. There is a metaphor available in the source material for this conversation that I want to use for a different purpose than the one it was designed for. The source material describes people in underground cities, people who had gone below the surface of the world to escape whatever was threatening them above, and who eventually, when the danger passed, returned to the surface. the sun too bright, the wind too sharp, the world too open. The specific disorientation of returning to a world that has been absent for so long that its normal qualities feel extreme. The memory of darkness staying even after the light returned. There is something in that image that maps onto what it means to try to think about the silent age from our current position. We live in a civilization built on the surface of human history, the visible, recorded, literate surface where things are written down and preserved and transmitted in forms that outlast the people who created them. And the silent age is not on that surface. The silent age is below it, below the first written word and the first city and the first law, in the depths where the record becomes sparse and then sparse beyond sparseness and then effectively absent, where only the most durable residue of human experience has survived and everything else has dissolved into the darkness of geological time. To think about the silent age is to go down into those depths, below the surface of what we know how to see, and to try to find there, in the darkness where the record almost runs out, the evidence that something real was present before the record began. And then, having spent some time in that depth, having sat with the ochre and the shells and the burials and the handprints and the footprints and the genetic evidence of ancient encounters with beings who are now entirely gone, having tried to imagine the social worlds and the knowledge systems and the symbolic cultures and the ceremonies and the conversations around the fires that the evidence points toward, even as it cannot show them directly, we return to the surface, to the world we know how to talk about, to the history we have names and dates for, to the civilization that produced writing and has therefore produced a record. And the return to the surface, after spending time in the depths of the silent age, should produce something like what the people in the underground city felt when they finally climbed back into the light. A sense that the world is larger than it appeared before, that the sunlight is more complicated than it seemed, that the familiar surface of things carries beneath it a depth that the surface alone does not reveal. Civilization is still extraordinary. Its achievements are still real, but it is not the whole story. It did not emerge from nothing. It rose from 90,000 years of fully human life that preceded it, built by people of complete cognitive modernity who left almost no trace that has survived, and whose specific contributions to the accumulated human understanding of what it means to be alive are among the most irrecoverable losses in all of history. The silence of the silent age holds the real depth of the human story. Not the most documented part of it, not the most legible part, not the part with names and dates and causes and consequences that can be traced forward into the world we currently inhabit. The real depth, the specific experience of being human before civilization, organized that experience into the specific forms we have since come to treat as natural and inevitable. The experience of knowing the world through your own body and your community's memory, rather than through accumulated written records. The experience of living in an unmediated relationship with the specific landscape you inhabited, knowing it with an intimacy and a dependency that most modern people can barely imagine. The experience of being part of a community that was genuinely your whole world, where the bonds between people had not been thinned by the availability of alternatives and the dilution of anonymity. The experience of building a shared symbolic world in language and ceremony and story, rather than in text and institution. None of this is meant to romanticize the silent age or suggest that it was better than what came after. The silent age had its own forms of suffering, and its own forms of injustice, and its own forms of violence, and the lives lived in it were often hard in ways that most people in modern industrialized societies are fortunate to never have to experience. But it was fully human, in every dimension of what that means. And its near total absence from the record by which we know ourselves is a real impoverishment of our self-understanding. We think we know what we are because we know 10,000 years of what we are. We know the civilized form. We know the literate form. We know the agricultural and urban and industrial form. These are real forms of human life, and they deserve careful attention. But they are not the only forms, and they are not the original forms, and understanding them without understanding the 90,000 years they grew from is like trying to understand a tree by examining only the top few branches and ignoring everything that lies below. The silence holds the roots, and the roots, even though they are underground and invisible and increasingly difficult to trace the further down you go, are part of the tree. They are what made the visible parts possible. They are what the visible parts are still, in ways we cannot always see clearly, drawing from. Every fear response tuned in the silent age that still activates in a modern nervous system. Every social instinct calibrated in the silent age that still shapes the way people organize themselves and feel about each other. Every hunger for meaning and story and ceremony and fire that the silent age built into the human mind, and that civilization has channeled and elaborated and structured, but has not created and cannot eliminate. These are the roots in the silence, and they are yours as surely as they were the possession of the people who first developed them, in the darkness before the record, in the human age that no one has yet found adequate words to name. Let me end where everything in human history ends and begins, at the fire. Not the fire of destruction or the fire of industry or the fire of any of the specific uses that civilization has made of the controlled combustion of organic material. The original fire. The fire at the center of the camp, built at the end of the day from whatever fuel was available, tended through the night, against the darkness and the cold. The fire around which the community gathered when the work was done, and the children were close, and the specific quality of the day's ending settled over everything like the specific quality of light that belongs to that time. This fire was burning in the silent age. It was burning 90,000 years before the first city, in every inhabited region of the world, in every community that had yet had time to build anything resembling the kind of record that we can access from our current position in history. It was the center of the world, in the specific sense that it was the place where the world of each day's community was renewed, where the bonds were maintained, where the knowledge was passed, where the stories were told, where the specific human ritual of ending the day and preparing for the night and being together in the darkness was performed night after night, for longer than we can easily imagine. And then the fire died down, as it always does, as it will always do. And the people around it lay down and closed their eyes, and the world went quiet, and the darkness came fully in around what remained of the light. And somewhere in that quiet, in the specific hush that follows the ending of the fire and the beginning of sleep, the people of the silent age lay in the specific darkness of whatever shelter they had made, and listened to the world outside and felt the specific weight of the day releasing and drifted into the country of sleep that is the same country for every human being who has ever lived, the same darkness and the same surrender and the same trust that the morning will come again. They are gone now. The fires are gone, and the people are gone, and the knowledge is gone, and the stories and the ceremonies and the specific languages in which the stories were told are all gone. But the pattern that produced them is not gone. It is in you, encoded in the architecture of your nervous system and the organization of your social instincts and the specific hungers that make you human. It is in the way you feel at the end of the day, the specific quality of fatigue and release that comes when the work is done, and the children are close, and the fire, in whatever form you keep it, gives it specific warmth and light. It is in the way you lean towards story and away from silence when the darkness comes. It is in the specific weight of the night and the specific trust that morning will return. The silent age is in you, not as memory, not as tradition, not in any form that conscious thought can access directly, but in the body, in the ancient circuits that were built in the silent age and have not been changed by civilization because they were built too deep to reach, in the layer of the nervous system that predates language and predates culture and predates civilization by the full 90,000 years of the silent age. You are the continuation of a story that began before anyone knew how to write it down, and its beginning was not primitive or impoverished or simple. It was fully human in every way that the word means. Sleep well. You come from deep time. You come from the people who pressed their hands against the cold stone in the dark and blew pigment around their fingers, and left the outline there for whoever might come later. We came. We found it. And now, in whatever small way the words of a late night can honor people 90,000 years gone, we have tried to say back to them across all that darkness what they were trying to say forward to us. We know you were there. We know you were real. We know the silence is not empty, that it is full of you, full of everything you built and knew and loved and were afraid of and mourned and celebrated and sang and told stories about, in the dark around fires whose light is gone. We know, and we will not forget. Among the things that dissolved most completely from the silent age are the specific relationships between human communities and the specific animals of their environments. Not the fossil record of those animals, not the genetic traces of hunting pressure on animal populations, not the archaeological signatures of bone middens and butchering sites. Those things exist in fragmentary form, and they tell us something about what was eaten and how it was killed. What they cannot tell us is anything about the texture of the relationship, the specific knowledge that specific communities had about specific animals in specific places, the understanding that went far beyond knowing how to kill them into the kind of intimate, respectful, complicated knowledge of another being's nature that comes from living alongside it for generations. Indigenous communities around the world, where the connection to ancestral territory survived long enough to be documented by anthropologists and ethnobiologists, have consistently demonstrated knowledge of local animal behavior and ecology that surprises and sometimes exceeds that of professional biologists. Not as an anomaly or a curiosity, but as the predictable result of what happens when a community pays close, sustained, practically motivated attention to the animals they share a landscape with for generation after generation. The migration timing of specific species. The specific behavioral indicators that predict predator activity. The specific environmental conditions that affect prey distribution. The specific calls and behaviors that communicate information across the boundary between species. This knowledge was accumulated in the silent age, in every inhabited environment on Earth, by communities whose survival depended on knowing the animals they lived with. And the relationship was not purely utilitarian. In every documented hunter-gatherer society, the relationship between the community and the animals they hunted and the animals they lived near is embedded in a framework of spiritual and moral significance, of obligations and reciprocity, and specific understandings about what it means to take a life and what is owed in return. The specific content of these frameworks varies enormously. But the fact of the framework, the embedding of the practical relationship within a moral and spiritual context that acknowledges the full significance of the animal as a being with its own nature and its own value is nearly universal. And it was present in the Silent Age, giving to the human relationship with the animal world a texture and a depth that subsequent civilizations have mostly, to their cost, abandoned. The animals of the Silent Age were not just food sources or threats or resources. They were presences in the world, entities with their own forms of knowledge and their own ways of being in the world, and the communities that lived alongside them knew this in ways that went far deeper than any abstract philosophical position. They knew it the way you know things you have spent your whole life paying close attention to, with the specific intimacy of long, careful, practically motivated observation. That knowledge is gone as the languages in which it was encoded and the specific ceremonies in which it was honored. But the animals are still here, the descendants of the same animals whose specific natures were once known in that depth, still moving through landscapes that were once intimately known and are now mostly not, carrying in their behavior patterns and their evolutionary adaptations the partial record of a relationship with human beings that goes back 90,000 years, and that, in the Silent Age, was of a quality that the world has mostly not seen since. If the knowledge of the animals is one of the great losses of the Silent Age, the knowledge of the plants is another, and possibly a larger one. Not because plant knowledge is more important than animal knowledge in any absolute sense, but because the diversity and the specificity and the sheer volume of empirical, pharmacological and ecological knowledge about plants that was developed in the Silent Age and the fraction of it that survived into the modern era suggests that what was lost was vast beyond any easy measure. A single forager in a richly vegetated environment might need to recognize and understand the specific properties of several hundred plant species to navigate their territory safely and use its resources effectively. Not just whether a plant is edible in a general sense, but specifically when it is edible, in what preparation, in what quantity, in combination with what other foods. The specific plants that are edible only when young, the specific plants that are toxic in their raw form, but safe when cooked or fermented or dried or treated with specific minerals, the specific plants that accelerate the healing of specific kinds of wounds, the specific plants that reduce fever, the specific plants that relieve pain, the specific plants that manage the symptoms of specific endemic diseases, the specific plants that have specific effects on specific physiological systems in specific dosages. All of this knowledge developed over generations by communities whose members got sick and were treated with varying success and remembered what worked, whose members were poisoned by mistakes and remembered what to avoid, whose members accumulated the specific observations that only a long life of careful attention to outcomes can produce. All of it was present in the Silent Age, encoded in the oral traditions of hundreds of thousands of specific communities in hundreds of thousands of specific environments. The pharmacological knowledge that has been documented from the oral traditions of indigenous communities that survived into the modern era has, as mentioned earlier, repeatedly turned out to contain genuine therapeutic significance. But the communities that survived long enough to be documented represent a tiny fraction of the communities that existed in the Silent Age. The specific plant knowledge of communities in environments that were subsequently destroyed by agriculture or desertification or urban development, communities in the lowland forests that are now underwater, communities in the that are now desert, communities in the temperate forests that were cleared for fields 3,000 years ago. All of this is gone, dissolved with the communities that held it, leaving no trace that any subsequent investigation can recover. The loss of this knowledge is not only a historical tragedy, it has practical consequences. The specific pharmacological potential of many plant species in many environments has never been investigated by formal science. The traditional uses that indigenous communities developed for these species, which represented the results of thousands of years of empirical research conducted under the most rigorous conditions imaginable, have in many cases been lost before anyone with access to modern analytical tools had the opportunity to evaluate them. Some of what was lost may have included treatments for conditions that formal medicine has still not found adequate solutions for. We cannot know, which is precisely the problem. The silence is absolute. And somewhere in that absolute silence there are cures for things that people are still dying from. There is a persistent and damaging assumption in popular accounts of the Silent Age, which is that the technology of that period was uniformly simple and primitive, that the stone tools that survive in the archaeological record are representative of the full range of technological sophistication available to the people who made them, and that the absence of evidence for more complex technology is evidence of its absence. This assumption is wrong, and it is wrong in a specific and important way. Stone tools survive, and almost everything else does not, which means the technological record of the Silent Age is radically incomplete, in a way that systematically underrepresents the complexity of what was there. Consider what we know must have existed from inference, if not from direct evidence. The colonization of Australia no later than 50,000 years ago, and possibly significantly earlier, required watercraft capable of navigating at least 60 to 70 kilometers of open ocean. Those watercraft were almost certainly made from wood and bark and fiber and other organic materials. They are completely gone. The cold weather clothing that allowed modern humans to survive in the subarctic environments of glacial Europe and Central Asia, environments that would kill an unprotected person in hours, was made of animal skins and plant fiber and sinew thread. The bone needles that have been found, some of them 50,000 years old, are the only traces of a sophisticated clothing technology of which the actual garments have entirely dissolved. The nets and the baskets and the cordage and the wooden tools and the containers made of bark and skin and plant material that constituted the bulk of the material culture of the Silent Age, all of it is gone. What survives is the hardest and most durable residue, the stone. And from the stone, you can make reasonable inferences about the people who made it, because the specific stone-working techniques of the Silent Age required considerable skill and considerable understanding of the mechanical properties of different stone types. The Levallois technique, for instance, in which a large stone is prepared with a series of preliminary flakes before a final, specifically shaped flake is struck from the prepared core, requires planning multiple steps ahead, an ability to visualize the final form in the unworked stone, and a motor skill developed through years of practice. This is not the technology of beings in the early stages of developing cognition. This is the technology of beings who are already fully capable of the multi-step planning and fine motor precision that complex technology requires, applying those capacities to the specific domain of stone, which happens to be the domain that time has preserved. The rest of the technology, the organic technology, was as sophisticated in its own domain as the stone technology was in its. The people who could plan 5 steps ahead in shaping a flint core could also plan 5 steps ahead in designing a garment that would protect against a specific kind of cold, or a trap that would capture a specific kind of animal, or a vessel that would hold a specific kind of liquid without leaking, or a basket that would carry a specific weight over a specific distance without breaking. The sophistication was there. The materials were there. The only thing missing is the preservation, and the absence of preservation is not the absence of the technology. Every night for 90,000 years, the people of the Silent Age looked up at the same sky that you can see on a clear night away from city lights. The same patterns of stars, the same slow revolution of those patterns through the seasons, the same moon with its reliable 29-day cycle, the same Milky Way stretching across the darkness. The same planets moving slowly through the field of stars in their specific cycles, and the people of the Silent Age, who had no other permanent record of time, who lived in a world where the rhythms of the year were not written in calendars, but had to be read from the natural world itself, paid attention to that sky in ways and with a depth of understanding that most people in modern industrialized societies have entirely lost. The night sky was the oldest clock and the oldest calendar, the most reliable source of information about where you were in the year and how long until the season would change, and when the particular animals you depended on would be moving through particular parts of the landscape. The specific stars and star clusters that rose above the horizon at specific times of year correlated with specific seasonal events. The beginning of certain plant flowering seasons, the arrival of migratory animals, the time when specific coastal resources would be at their most abundant. Reading those correlations and passing that reading along to the next generation in forms that were stable enough to survive across many human lifetimes was a form of practical astronomical knowledge of genuine value and genuine sophistication. There is evidence, controversial but intriguing, that some of the oldest oral astronomical traditions preserved in living cultures may carry information that originated before the separation of the populations that now tell those stories, which would mean information encoded in narrative tens of thousands of years ago. The association of the Pleiades star cluster with a group of sisters or female figures appears in cultural traditions so geographically separated that independent invention is possible, but common origin is also possible. And the common origin, if it exists, would need to be placed far back in the period of the Silent Age to account for the geographic distribution of the similarity. The specific myths may or may not be connected, but the practice of encoding astronomical information in narrative, of using story as a mnemonic for sky knowledge that could be passed from generation to generation across centuries and millennia, was almost certainly present in the Silent Age, in communities that had very good practical reasons to preserve accurate astronomical knowledge across longer spans of time than individual human lifetimes allowed. The sky above them was the same sky above you tonight. The same stars in the same patterns, doing the same reliable things they have always done. The same Pleiades, the same Orion, the same long, slow cycle of the moon. When you lie down and look at the ceiling before you close your eyes, when you feel the specific quality of the night and its quietness, you are in the same darkness that the people of the Silent Age spent 90,000 years navigating by the light of those stars and by the knowledge that the stars encoded. The sky has not changed. The darkness has not changed. What has changed is that most of us have forgotten how to read it, and the specific knowledge that the people of the Silent Age built over 90,000 years of careful attention to the lights above them is, like almost everything else they built, mostly gone. Grief is universal. The specific pain of losing someone you love, the specific way that the world reorganizes itself around the absence of a person who was a fixed point in your understanding of what the world contained, the specific weight that grief carries, and the specific ways it does not simply end, but instead slowly becomes integrated into the ongoing experience of being alive. These are features of human experience that have not changed in 90,000 years and will not change in the 90,000 years to come. The people of the Silent Age grieved exactly as you have grieved. with the same desperation in the immediate aftermath, the same searching for the person in the world and finding them absent everywhere, the same dreams in which they reappear and then the specific pain of waking, the same long process of slowly building a life that contains the loss without being defined entirely by it. And the people of the Silent Age gave grief the ritual it requires. We know this because the burials tell us. The careful placement of the body, the specific objects chosen for inclusion, the red ochre marking the bones. The decision to put the dead person somewhere specific, somewhere that could be remembered and potentially returned to, rather than simply leaving them where they fell. These are the material traces of the same human need that drives funerals and memorials and cemeteries and death rituals in every subsequent culture. The need to mark the ending of a specific life with specific acknowledgement. The need to say, in whatever form the community has available, that this person mattered, that their life had weight, that the world is different now because they are gone from it. What specific griefs the Silent Age contained, we cannot know. Not a single name of a single person grieved by a specific other person in the Silent Age has survived. Not a single relationship, not a single loss, not a single specific face that was mourned by specific other faces in the specific language of the Silent Age. The grief is gone with the people who felt it, as completely as everything else from those years. And what remains is only the material trace of the practice of grief, the careful burials and the ochre and the objects placed with the dead, which tell us that the grief was there without being able to tell us anything specific about any specific instance of it. But the grief was there. In the same deep and specific way that grief always is, in the exact same quality of absence and pain and love, persisting past the body that generated it, the people of the Silent Age grieved. They sat with their dead. They arranged them carefully. They said whatever needed to be said in whatever language they had, and then they went on living in the specific way that people always go on living after profound loss, diminished, carrying the absence, finding that the world has a different shape than it had before, and eventually finding a way to live in that differently shaped world without ever entirely making peace with the change. The grief of the Silent Age is the same grief you carry. The silence around it is simply larger because all the names and all the faces and all the specific instances of it are gone, and what remains is only the pattern, the universal human pattern of loving and losing and grieving and persisting, repeated billions of times in 90,000 years, and leaving almost no trace except the shape of the burials and the knowledge that it happened. There is a point in any honest reckoning with the Silent Age at which you have to stop and acknowledge the edge of what the evidence allows you to say, and the beginning of the vast territory of what the evidence simply cannot reveal. We have been traveling along that edge throughout this conversation, trying to stay on the side of what can be reasonably inferred from what we know, while acknowledging the enormous weight of what lies on the other side, in the region of pure imagination or pure silence. But it is worth stopping at the edge explicitly and looking at it clearly, because what you see there is one of the most important things the Silent Age has to teach. The ochre engravings at Blombos tell you that someone, 77,000 years ago, was capable of deliberate geometric abstraction and chose to apply that capacity to marking a piece of stone. They do not tell you why. They do not tell you whether the geometric pattern had a specific meaning within a shared symbolic system, whether it was a personal expression with private significance, whether it was a mark of ownership or a component of ritual preparation, or simply an aesthetic act for its own sake. They do not tell you whether other members of the person's community understood what the pattern meant or whether they recognized it as significant. The specific meaning, the specific social and symbolic context, the specific motivation. All of this lies on the other side of the edge, in the silence that the ochre cannot penetrate. The burials at Kafze tell you that someone 100,000 years ago treated a dead person with care and deliberateness that implies belief in the significance of the dead person's continued existence in some form. They do not tell you what that form was. They do not tell you whether the people who buried the dead believed in a specific afterlife or in the continued presence of the dead among the living as spiritual entities, or in some transformation of the person into another form of being, or in something for which no word in any subsequent language is quite adequate. The specific theology, the specific cosmological framework within which the burial practice made sense. All of this lies on the other side of the edge. This edge is important to acknowledge, not because it means the silent age is unknowable, but because it means that the specific form of not knowing that applies to the silent age is different from ordinary historical ignorance. We do not know the facts of the silent age in the way that we do not know the facts of a battle that was poorly documented, or a political decision that left no written record. We know the physical traces. What we lack is the interpretive framework, the shared understanding of what those traces meant to the people who made them, without which the traces remain permanently ambiguous. The edge is the point where the physical evidence runs out and the shared meaning begins, and the shared meaning of the silent age is gone as completely as the languages it was carried in. But the edge is also a kind of invitation. It is an invitation to sit with genuine uncertainty, not the uncertainty of unsolved mysteries that more research might eventually resolve, but the uncertainty of knowledge that no additional evidence will ever fully replace, the specific absence of a whole dimension of human experience that dissolved with the organic materials it was encoded in. The silent age asks you to sit with that kind of uncertainty, and not to fill it hastily with the projection of your own assumptions, not to assume that the people of the silent age believed what you would believe in their position, or were motivated by what would motivate you, or experience the world in ways that map cleanly onto the categories you have available. They were different from you in ways you cannot fully specify, because the specifics are gone. And that specific, irrecoverable difference is part of what makes the silent age worth sitting with. It is the reminder that the human story is larger and stranger and more diverse than any single vantage point within it can see. There is a way of thinking about the silence of the silent age that I want to offer as a final frame, a way that does not treat the silence as primarily a deprivation, as the absence of something that should have been there and isn't, but as a kind of presence in its own right. The silence is real. 90,000 years of human experience dissolved to almost nothing. The loss is real. But the silence that resulted from that dissolution is itself a kind of record, a record of what kind of world the silent age was and what kind of materials it used for living, and what that tells us about the relationship between human life and the material world it inhabits. The silent age was silent because it was built from the living world. Wood and bone and plant fiber and animal skin and shell and feather and clay unfired and all the other organic and semi-organic materials that the world provides to beings who are part of it rather than separate from it. These materials have the quality of all living things. They change and they decay, and they return to the elements from which they came. They do not persist. They do not outlast the beings who used them by very long, in geological terms. The silent age used materials that return to the earth. and so the silent age returned to the earth, and what remains is only the residue that was hard enough, or dry enough, or cold enough, or deep enough to resist the chemistry of dissolution for longer than everything else. This is different from what civilization does. Civilization, from its earliest forms, has been in the business of creating permanence, of finding ways to preserve human knowledge and human meaning in forms that outlast the human beings who generated them. Writing on clay or stone or papyrus, buildings of fired brick and cut stone, roads and canals and aqueducts. The specific project of civilization is, among other things, the project of making the human world more permanent, of lifting it above the organic and the impermanent, and the returning to earth and into the realm of the durable and the transmissible. This project has been extraordinarily successful by its own terms. The record that civilization produced has survived in ways that the silent age could not match. And the survival of that record is genuinely valuable, genuinely important to subsequent generations and to our understanding of our own story. But the silence of the silent age is also telling us something about what was left behind when civilization made that turn toward permanence. The living world, the world of organic materials and returning to earth, and the specific intimacy with the cycling of the natural world that comes from building your life from its materials, that world is quieter in the record than the stone buildings and the clay tablets. It was not less real. It was not less full of life and knowledge and meaning. It was simply made of different stuff, stuff that the silence has swallowed, and what remains is the outline of it, the shape of the absence, which is itself a kind of presence if you know how to read it. The silence of the silent age is the presence of a way of being human that we have mostly lost track of. The way that builds its world from what the living world provides and returns it to the living world when it is done. The silence is the shape of that way of being, pressing through the record in the negative space between the fragments, asking to be recognized and honored even though it cannot be directly heard. And the recognition, even at this distance, even across all the centuries of civilization that have made the silence as deep as it is something we can give. Not full understanding, not the recovery of what was lost, but the acknowledgement that it was there, that it was real, that the silence is not emptiness but the presence of everything that was too alive to last. The most durable archive of the silent age is not the ochre and not the shell beads and not the burials. It is you, your body. Not in any metaphorical or spiritual sense, but in the specific, physical, biological sense, that your body is the end product of a developmental and evolutionary process that includes the full 90,000 years of the silent age and every year before it. The architecture of your immune system includes sequences that are optimized to address pathogens your ancestors encountered in the silent age. The calibration of your circadian rhythm reflects the specific patterns of light and dark in African environments, where modern humans spent most of the silent age. The specific foods your gut microbiome is optimized to process reflect the dietary patterns of hunter-gatherer communities across the silent age. The structure of your musculoskeletal system, the specific strengths and weaknesses of specific joints and muscle groups, reflects the specific physical demands of the life that was typical in the silent age. More than any of this, your brain reflects the silent age, the specific architecture of the human brain, as noted earlier in this conversation, was already in place when the silent age began. What the silent age added to the already present architecture was 90,000 years of selection pressure that refined the calibration of that architecture to the specific demands of the specific life the silent age required. The social brain, the neural systems that track the social world with such extraordinary sensitivity, were refined in communities where the social world was the primary determinant of survival and reproduction. The emotional systems that place such heavy weight on belonging and exclusion and status and reciprocity were calibrated in communities where the specific stakes of social dynamics were survival stakes, where being wrong about who you could trust or who owed you what could get you killed. The cognitive tendencies that generate religious and spiritual experience were refined in communities where the framework of shared meaning that those tendencies produce was the social glue that held communities together in conditions of shared adversity. All of this is in your body, not as memory, not as instinct in any simple sense, but as the specific calibration of specific biological systems that were tuned over 90,000 years of human experience to perform their functions in a particular kind of world. The world has changed. The calibration has not significantly, not in the few thousand years since civilization began, because evolution does not work that fast, and natural selection does not reward adaptations to conditions that have only recently changed. You are a creature of the silent age living in a civilized world, carrying in your body the specific sensitivities and hungers and fears and social instincts that were tuned for a very different environment than the one you currently inhabit. Most of the time, this is irrelevant. The ancient equipment does what it was designed to do, and what it was designed to do is mostly adequate for the conditions it currently operates in. But sometimes, the mismatch shows in the chronic low-grade stress response that activates when you face the modern world's specific threats that the ancient equipment was not designed for. In the social pain that rejection produces, out of all proportion to any actual threat. In the specific hunger for the kinds of social connection and the kinds of physical activity and the kinds of relationship with the natural world that the silent age required and that modern life often fails to provide. You are the archive of the silent age. Not the only archive, not the most legible archive, but the most continuously maintained and the most personally immediate archive of what those years produced and what they required and what they made us into. Every time you feel the specific things that humans feel, the fear and the love and the hunger for meaning, and the peace of the fire and the specific satisfaction of a story well told, you are accessing the archive. The silent age is not past. It is present in the body, running its ancient programs in the specific circumstances of your specific life, connecting you to 90,000 years of human experience, whether you know it or not. Every night of the silent age ended. The fire died down, the darkness settled in, the community slept, and then, every morning, the light came back. The specific quality of early morning light in whatever landscape the community inhabited, coming over whatever horizon was there, falling on whatever faces were turned toward it, bringing the return of vision and warmth and the renewal of the day's possibility. Every morning, for 90,000 years of mornings, the light came back, the people got up, the fire was rebuilt or rekindled, the day's work began. This is the other side of the loss, the side that the loss can obscure if you spend too long in the darkness of the silence. The people of the silent age got up every morning and rebuilt their fires and went on with their lives. Through the Toba winter and through the glacial maxima and through every other catastrophe that the silent age contained, someone survived and rebuilt and went on. The specific knowledge that a specific community had when a catastrophe struck might not survive entirely, but the community rebuilt it, or built something new from whatever remained, because that is what fully modern human beings do. They face the world with everything they have, and they find a way forward. It took longer than it should have sometimes. It cost more than it should have sometimes. But it kept happening. The fires were rebuilt. The knowledge was reconstructed or replaced. The communities reorganized and returned to the surface and went on. The silent age was full of mornings, full of the specific human experience of the day beginning again, of yesterday's grief still present, but yesterday's exhaustion renewed into something resembling possibility, of the specific quality of the early light falling on faces that had spent the night in darkness and were now turning again toward what the day would bring. That experience, repeated billions of times in 90,000 years, is the heartbeat of the silent age, the thing underneath all the catastrophe and the loss that kept the story going long enough for civilization to be possible. The mornings kept coming. The people kept getting up. The fires kept being rebuilt. And so the morning after the Silent Age, the morning when the first city rose from the plains of Mesopotamia, and the first symbol was pressed into clay, and the first record was made that would survive long enough for us to read it thousands of years later. That morning was not a miracle or a spontaneous invention. It was the morning after 90,000 years of mornings, each one of which was survived by people who had the same brain and the same social needs and the same hunger for meaning and the same love for their children that the people of the first cities had. The first civilization did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from the accumulated depth of the Silent Age, from the knowledge and the experience and the specifically human resilience that 90,000 years of morning after morning had produced. And the silence of all those years is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of the depth that made the surface possible. Tonight, you will sleep. Tomorrow morning, you will get up, and the light will come in, and the day will begin, and you will be, in the most direct and immediate biological sense, the latest instance of a process that has been repeating since before the first city existed, since before the first word was written down, since before anything that history has recorded. You will be the continuation of the morning. And in that continuation, however small and however ordinary it may feel from the inside, the Silent Age is not silent. It is speaking in the only voice that has never been interrupted, the voice of a living body, waking in the light. Sleep well. Tomorrow is waiting. Among all the things that the Silent Age produced and that time has swallowed, the music is perhaps the most immediately affecting to think about. Not because music is more important than language or knowledge or ceremony or any of the other things that have dissolved, but because music is the form of human expression that most completely bypasses intellectual mediation and arrives directly in the body, that reaches past the analytical layers of conscious thought into the part of experience that does not need words to be real. And that music, every note of it, for 90,000 years of human evenings, is gone. A vulture bone flute was found at Geisenklösterler Cave in Germany, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, along with flutes from several other sites in the same region dating to a similar period. These are the oldest musical instruments we have found. When a replica was made and played by a musician, the sounds it produced were recognizable immediately as music, pitched, melodic, capable of expressing something emotional that transcends whatever cultural context produced them. The bone was carefully selected, the holes carefully positioned, the instrument built by someone who understood what they were making and what they wanted it to do. This is not the accidental noise of someone banging on things and happening to produce something pleasant. This is deliberate musical instrument construction by someone who had a specific understanding of how sound and pitch and melody work and what they are for. But the flutes from 40,000 years ago did not emerge from nothing any more than anything else in the Silent Age did. the understanding of sound and pitch and melody that produced those instruments was already old by the time they were made. It had been accumulating for tens of thousands of years before, in communities where music was made from the voice and from simpler instruments that have not survived, from percussive instruments of wood and skin and hollow bone and dried seed pods, that the chemistry of time has entirely dissolved. The songs themselves, which is what matters most and what is most completely gone, predate the instruments by however many thousands of years. The impulse to sing preceded the impulse to make an instrument to accompany the singing. And the impulse to sing is as old as the human voice, as old as the specifically human form of social bonding and emotional expression that music enables. What did they sing? The specific melodies and the specific rhythms and the specific words, if they had words, are gone absolutely. Not even the ghost of a ghost remains. The music of 90,000 years of human evenings is gone as completely as it is possible for anything to be gone, lost at the speed of sound, which is to say immediately and permanently and without remainder. What remains is only the knowledge that it was there, inferred from the universality of human music-making, from the biological systems that generate and respond to music, and that are as ancient as any feature of the modern human brain, from the flutes that are old enough to survive, and that point backward to the much older tradition they represent. The music was there. Every night of the Silent Age, in the specific form each specific community had developed, in its specific place, with its specific materials and its specific tradition, music was there. And it has gone so completely that the only way to honor it is to sit with the fact of its absence, which is to say, to sit with the full weight of the silence and know what it contains. There is a perspective available on the Silent Age that is not human, and is not historical, and is not particularly comforting, but that is nonetheless true and worth acknowledging before we end. It is the perspective of the stone that the people of the Silent Age worked, that they shaped and knapped and ground and used and eventually left behind in the places they had been, the stone that has survived when everything else dissolved, has a relationship to time that is simply not available to any biological being. Stone does not age in the way that organic things age. It does not decay. It changes only slowly, over geological timescales, in response to the chemistry of its environment. And so the stone that was worked by human hands 70,000 years ago looks very much like stone that was worked 30,000 years ago. And both of them look recognizable to eyes trained to see them, as objects made by beings with minds and intentions and specific purposes. The stone remembers in the only way stone remembers, by remaining. It preserves the shape of the thought that made it, the specific decision to strike here rather than there, the specific understanding of how this kind of stone would respond to this kind of pressure, the specific shape that the maker was moving toward, and that the finished tool or the finished engraving expresses. The shape of the thought is pressed into the shape of the stone, and the stone, being stone, keeps it. For thousands of years, for tens of thousands of years, for 100,000 years, waiting with the patience of stone for someone to come along with the training to see what it contains and the willingness to sit with what it means. The ochre at Blombos Cave waited 77,000 years for Klaus Comrie and Chris Henshelwood to uncover it and recognize what it was. The handprints at Chauvet waited 30,000 years for Jean-Marie Chauvet and his companions to discover them in 1994. The shell beads of North Africa waited 100,000 years and more for the archaeologists who eventually found them and dated them and understood that they were ornaments. In each case, the stone or the shell or the mineral pigment waited, not knowing it was waiting, not with any particular relationship to the passage of time, simply remaining in the way that hard things remain, while 10,000 generations of human beings who did not know about them lived and died above them or around them. And the waiting was not in vain. We found them. We found these tiny, inadequate, heartbreakingly sparse fragments of the most enormous human silence there has ever been, and we recognize them for what they were, and we are trying, here and in every conversation that takes the silent age seriously, to honor what they represent. Not to replace the silence with something comfortable or comprehensible. Not to close the gap between us and the people of the silent age with the false intimacy of projection and assumption, but to acknowledge with the full weight of attention that 90,000 years of human experience deserves, that the stone remembers what everything else has forgotten, that the marks made by human hands in the darkness before civilization are still here, still legible in the language of intention and craft, still waiting to be seen by whatever eyes come next. You are the eyes that came next. And the silence, for as long as you sit with it and take it seriously and let it be as large as it actually is not empty. It is the most human thing there is, the presence of a life that was fully lived and is now over, leaving behind the marks it could not help but make, asking only to be known. Before the last words and the final sleep, a final accounting. What the silent age was, as clearly as can be said across all the distances of time and silence that separate it from us tonight. It was 90,000 years. Fully modern human beings, neurologically identical to you, biologically equipped for the same range of thought and feeling and experience that you have. 90,000 years of them, in communities of every size, from small family bands to occasional large gatherings, in environments from the African savanna to the cold steppes of Central Asia, to the shores of what would eventually become Australia. Building their lives from the materials of the living world, wood and bone and skin and plant fiber and everything else the living world provides to beings who know how to use it. Transmitting their knowledge in the only medium available to them, the human voice, one generation to the next, in languages we will never know, around fires we cannot see. It was a time of genuine beauty, the specific beauty of a world not yet organized by civilization, wild and various and demanding and full of animals, whose specific natures were known with the intimacy that comes from long attention, full of landscapes whose specific resources were understood with the precision that comes from needing to understand them in order to survive, full of skies whose patterns were read with the fluency that comes from having no other clock. The people of the silent age lived in a world of extraordinary natural abundance and variety, and they knew it with a depth of knowledge that most subsequent people have not matched. That beauty was real. Their experience of it was real, and it is gone as completely as the knowledge of it, swallowed by the silence of the years. It was a time of genuine suffering. The Toba winter and the glacial maxima and the megafaunal extinctions and the repeated population crashes and the diseases with no treatment and the injuries with no medicine and the specific suffering of watching people you love die in conditions that could not be changed. The people of the silent age suffered enormously in ways that are hard to fully imagine from the cushioned distance of modern industrialized comfort, and the suffering was as real as the beauty, and it is as gone as the beauty, and it deserves the same honest acknowledgement. It was a time of love, the specific love of parents for their children, and the specific love of people for their communities, and the specific love of human beings for the specific places they had grown up in, and the specific animals and plants they had learned from childhood to know. This love was as real as any love has ever been. It was felt in the same specific way that love is always felt, with the same specific vulnerability and the same specific capacity to make loss devastating, in the same specific bodies that you are in tonight when you love what you love. The love of the silent age is gone with the people who felt it, as gone as everything else, and the size of the loss is the size of 90,000 years of love, which is a size that exceeds anything I know how to say about it. It was a time of hope, the specific human hope that things will be better, that the morning will come, that the threat will pass, that the season will turn, that the people who have died will somehow be with us still in a form we cannot quite see, that the lives we are building will mean something to the people who come after us, even if we cannot know what they will make of it. This hope was present in the silent age in the same specific form it always takes in human beings, as the specific refusal to accept that this is all there is, as the specific reaching towards something that is not yet visible, but might become so, as the specific act of pressing a hand against a cave wall in the dark and leaving the mark there for whoever comes later. That hope was real, and you are the evidence that it was not misplaced. You came later. You found the mark. The hope reached you across 90,000 years of silence in the shape of a human hand pressed against cold stone. That is what the silent age was. That is what it left. And now, having tried to honor it as best as words can manage, the last word is the simplest one: sleep. The same sleep that followed every day of the silent age, the same surrender to the darkness that all of us make at the end of every day, in a gesture as old as the species and as necessary as breathing. The day is done. The fire is low. The world goes quiet. Sleep well, and in the morning, carry the weight of all that silence forward into whatever your life holds next. Time in the silent age was not measured by the calendar that civilization invented, not divided into the standard units of days and weeks and months and years that we use almost without thinking as the natural structure of time. Time in the silent age was measured by the world itself, by the flowering of specific plants and the fruiting of others, and the migration of specific animals, and the flooding of rivers, and the return of certain rains, and the specific quality of light at different points in the annual cycle. Time was ecological before it was numerical, embedded in the living rhythms of the world rather than abstracted into units of counting. This is not a primitive relationship to time. It is a different relationship to time, one that requires a depth of attention to the natural world that the numerical relationship actively discourages. To know that it is approximately 2 months past the wet season, because the specific grass has reached the specific height, and the specific bird has returned to the specific territory, and the specific fruit has begun to ripen, you have to have paid close attention to all of those indicators across many previous years, have to have accumulated a catalogue of correlations between observable events that only comes from sustained, motivated engagement with the specific rhythms of a specific place. The people of the silent age who could read time from the world around them were doing something cognitively sophisticated and practically valuable, using a form of ecological knowledge that was developed over generations and transmitted with care, because the consequences of getting it wrong were serious. The seasons of the silent age were the same seasons we have now, driven by the same axial tilt of the same planet in the same orbit around the same sun. But they were experienced differently, lived through in a more direct and less mediated relationship with what the seasons actually bring: the changing light, the changing temperature, the changing abundance and scarcity of specific resources. The specific joy of the return of abundance after a period of scarcity, a joy that most people in modern, industrialized societies have no occasion to feel, was a regular feature of the emotional landscape of the Silent Age, repeated year after year in the form appropriate to the specific cycles of each specific environment, and the specific anxiety of the approach of scarcity, the reading of the signs that winter or dry season was coming, and the preparations that needed to be made, was equally regular. Equally a feature of the emotional calendar that the seasons created for the communities of the Silent Age. That emotional calendar, tuned to the specific rhythms of specific environments over 90,000 years, is not entirely gone from us. The specific pleasure of spring, even in environments where spring no longer brings the abundance of edible plants and returning game that it brought in the Silent Age, still activates something in the human nervous system that is disproportionate to the material change in circumstances. The specific melancholy of the shortening days in autumn still falls on people who have no practical reason to be troubled by it. These responses were calibrated in the Silent Age, when the seasons mattered in the immediate and physical way that the seasons matter to beings whose survival depends on reading them correctly, and they persist in us because the body remembers what the mind has forgotten. In the Silent Age, tools were not just objects. They were the materialized products of accumulated knowledge, the physical form in which years of understanding about the properties of specific materials and the specific demands of specific tasks was expressed. A well-made stone blade from the Silent Age is not just a sharp edge. It is the record of a way of thinking about stone, developed over generations of experimentation and refined observation, that understood the specific fracture properties of specific stone types, knew which stones would produce the sharpest edges, knew how to prepare a core to strike a blade of specific size and shape from it, knew how to complete the shaping of the blade without destroying it, knew how to mount it and use it and repair it. All of this knowledge was inside the tool in the same way that the knowledge of a craftsperson is inside the thing they make. Invisible to the casual eye, fully present to the trained one. The specific stone-working traditions of the Silent Age varied by region and by period, as you would expect from technologies that were adapted to the specific stones available in specific places and the specific tasks required by specific environments. Some traditions are characterized by particularly fine and technically demanding work, producing blades of extraordinary thinness and regularity that required a deep understanding of how stone would respond to controlled pressure at specific points. Others are more robust and less refined, producing tools that were workmanlike rather than elegant, but that served the specific purposes they were made for with equal effectiveness. None of them are simple. All of them are the products of extended training and accumulated expertise, applied to specific problems with specific materials in specific places. And the stone tools are only the most visible expression of a much broader technological intelligence that was operating in the Silent Age. The same cognitive capacities that produced a well-made flint blade also produced every other technology of those years. The traps and nets and fishing lines and watercraft and containers and clothing and shelters and all the other complex, solution-specific, knowledge-intensive technologies that the Silent Age required and that the Silent Age produced. The stone is what remained when everything else dissolved. But the intelligence that made the stone is the same intelligence that made the everything else, and the everything else was as sophisticated in its domain as the stone was in its. The tools of the Silent Age thought for the people who made them in the same way that any good tool thinks for its user, by embodying in their design the accumulated understanding of what the task requires and what the materials allow, so that the user, once they have mastered the tool, can act with a knowledge and efficiency that exceeds what they could generate from scratch in the moment. That embodied knowledge is gone with the tools that carried it, or most of it is. The stone remains. What remains is enough to tell us that the knowledge was real, was deep, was developed by minds of complete modern sophistication applying themselves to the problems of the Silent Age with all the creativity and intelligence they had. And the creativity and the intelligence were the same creativity and intelligence that has produced every subsequent technological achievement in human history. The Silent Age did not produce steam engines or microprocessors, but it produced minds that could have, given the materials and the time and the specific accumulated knowledge that those later developments required. The minds were already there. Everything that came after was built on them. And now we arrive at the night that is, in some ways, the most interesting night in all of human history. The night before the first record, the night before the first symbol pressed into clay, the night before the first stone wall laid in the first city, the night before the specific innovations that would eventually produce, a few thousand years later, the long and complex and documented history that we usually call human history. That night was, in every important way, identical to every other night of the Silent Age. People who were fully modern in their cognition and their biology and their emotional complexity lay down in the darkness of whatever shelter they had made and closed their eyes and slept. The fire died down around them. The world went quiet. Whatever stars were visible above their shelter turned slowly overhead in the pattern they had always turned in. And in the morning, they would get up and go about the business of the day that would eventually, through a long and complicated and contingent series of subsequent events, lead to someone deciding to press symbols into clay. They did not know they were on the eve of anything. There was no sense on that night or on any of the subsequent nights of the transition from the Silent Age to the documented one that something fundamental was changing, that the world was crossing a threshold from one kind of human history to another. The people who made the transition from hunter-gathering to farming where it happened mostly did it because specific local conditions made it advantageous, not because they understood that they were initiating a process that would eventually produce civilization. The people who built the first cities built them because the specific conditions of their specific time and place made that kind of settlement useful, not because they understood themselves to be beginning a new era of human history. The people who pressed the first symbols into clay did so for specific, practical purposes, probably to record economic transactions, not because they understood that they were inventing the technology that would eventually make the Silent Age silent in relation to everything that came after. The night before the record is the last night of the Silent Age, and on that last night, everything that had always been true about human life was still true. The fire, the community, the stories, the knowledge transmitted in voice and gesture and example, the love, the grief, the hunger for meaning, the specific beauty and the specific suffering of being alive in that specific time and place. The record had not yet begun, which means the Silent Age was still whole, still present, still the only story of humanity there was. And then the morning came, as it always had, and the day began. And somewhere, in a specific place, a specific person made a specific mark on a specific surface, and the silence of the Silent Age began its long, slow, gradual recession into the past, as the record expanded and deepened, and the distance between the present moment and the last unrecorded night grew larger and larger across the subsequent millennia. We live on the other side of that night, far on the other side, in a world so thoroughly documented and recorded and analyzed that the silence of the silent age can feel like ancient irrelevance. But it is not irrelevance. It is depth. It is the 90,000 years of fully human life that preceded the record, that made the record possible, that gave the people who eventually made the record the minds and the communities and the accumulated understanding that the specific invention of writing required. The night before the record is not the beginning of the story. It is a night in the middle of a story that had already been running for 90,000 years. The story you are part of is that story, the full one, the one that begins not with the first city but with the first fully modern human being who looked up at the night sky and felt the specific ache of wondering what it all meant. That person's question is still your question. The sky is still the same sky. The silence is still the silence of everything that has not yet been said and may never be. Sleep well. The silence holds more than you know. There is something that the silent age had that the documented age does not, and that is the specific beauty of an unrecorded world. A world in which nothing was preserved except what the people living in it chose to hold in memory and pass forward in voice and practice. A world in which every piece of knowledge had to earn its transmission by being useful enough and important enough to someone to want to pass it on. A world in which the only guarantee of continuity was the specific human act of caring enough about something to teach it to someone else. This world had a specific quality of presence, a specific weight of the immediate and the living, that the documented world has partially traded away for the specific security of the preserved and the recorded. When you live in a world where nothing is written down, the present moment is all there is. The past exists only in the memories of the people who carry it, and those memories are alive, interpretive, continuously reshaped by the needs and experiences of the people who hold them. The future exists only as expectation and preparation, not as planned and scheduled. What you have is now. This fire, these people, this food, this darkness, this specific quality of this specific night in this specific place. The specific attention to the present moment that this condition produces is not available in a world where the past is preserved in text and the future is planned in calendars. It is a different quality of being in the world, not better or worse in any absolute sense, but genuinely different. And it produced in the people who lived in it a specific kind of aliveness and attention that is worth acknowledging as its own form of beauty. The specific attention to the natural world that hunter-gatherer life requires and produces is one expression of this. When your survival depends on reading the world correctly, you read it with a quality of attention that most people in modern, industrialized societies never develop. The specific attention to other people when the small community of your band is the entire social world you have, and the bonds within it are the entire safety net available to you, produces a quality of social awareness and social care that the anonymity of large-scale society dilutes. The specific attention to your own body and its needs and capacities, when your body is the primary tool of your survival, and its condition matters immediately and practically to everything else you do, produces a quality of physical self-awareness that sedentary indoor life does not cultivate. These specific attentions were not virtues cultivated through philosophical practice. They were the natural result of living in a world that demanded them. And they produced in the people of the silent age a specific quality of being alive that the record of civilization has not preserved because it cannot be recorded, only lived. Tonight, in whatever specific quality of darkness and quiet you have arranged around yourself, you can catch a glimpse of it. The specific weight of the present moment, when you are not thinking about the past or the future, but only about this breath, this darkness, this specific quality of the night settling around you. The Silent Age lived in that moment for 90,000 years. It built its world there in the unrecorded present from materials that returned to the earth. And the world it built was as full and as real and as worth living as any world that has been built since. Sleep well in whatever present moment is yours tonight, carrying the weight of the Silent Age forward into tomorrow with the same trust that every person who has ever lived has placed in the morning. Everything in the Silent Age depended on one thread, the most fragile and most important thread in all of human history, the thread of transmission. The thread by which knowledge was passed from person to person, generation to generation, in the only form available to it in those years, which was the living human voice speaking into the ear of a living human being who was paying attention. No other medium, no backup, no redundancy except the redundancy of multiple people knowing the same things, which was present in healthy communities and absent when communities were catastrophically reduced. The thread of transmission was the entire infrastructure of human knowledge in the Silent Age. And the silence of the Silent Age is, to a very significant degree, the record of all the times that thread broke. It broke in the Toba winter, when populations were reduced to levels too small to maintain all the knowledge they had. It broke in the glacial maxima, when communities that had developed knowledge adapted to specific environments were displaced and reduced, and their specific knowledge died with the specific conditions that had made it relevant. It broke in every epidemic that swept through a small community and killed the elders who held the deepest knowledge before they could pass it on. It broke in every raid and every conflict that destroyed communities entirely. It broke in every migration to an entirely new environment, where the specific knowledge of the previous environment was no longer relevant and had to be replaced with new knowledge, developed from scratch. Each break was a loss, and the accumulation of losses over 90,000 years is the silence we inherit. And yet, the thread also held. It held through everything the Silent Age threw at it, because the specific human commitment to passing knowledge forward, the specific human care for the next generation that drives the act of teaching, was as strong in the Silent Age as it has ever been, and it was strong enough, often enough, to keep enough of the thread intact that the chain of transmission reached the present moment. Every person alive today is descended from people who managed to transmit enough knowledge to enough of the next generation that their line continued unbroken through 90,000 years of catastrophe and loss. The thread broke in countless specific places. It held in enough places to get us here, and the holding was not passive or automatic. It was the specific, effortful, costly act of teaching and learning and caring enough about the next generation to do the work that transmission requires, generation after generation, in the darkness before the record, without any way to know that it would eventually matter to someone 90,000 years later trying to understand where they came from. You are the evidence that the thread held. And the silence of the Silent Age is the record of all the thread that broke. Both are true. Both deserve to be held at once. The extraordinary resilience of the thread that brought human knowledge from the first fires to the present, and the extraordinary magnitude of the loss represented by every place the thread broke, and everything that was carried on, that section of thread, is now gone. The Silent Age was both of these things simultaneously, and the specific quality of the silence it left is the quality of both at once, the presence of an enormous loss inside an extraordinary survival. Tonight, you are the survival, and you know now something of the loss. Carry both of them into whatever sleep comes.